Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. And I am excited to have the second webinar in the series of impacts of domestic violence on abused parents and their children. And today we have Tammy Truitt-Giroux from the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center and Paula Jillian from the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. They are the two presenters that we had last time. And we also have Tien Ung. She is from Futures Without Violence, and she is joining us today as well. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Tammy. Thank you, Tammy.
Good morning, and thank you for all being here again. It's still disconcerting to try to talk to you through the computer. I'm not sure if I'll ever get used to that. But my name is Tammy Truitt-Giroux, and I introduced myself last time, and if you were on, I gave you a little bit more information about me personally, but I'm the Executive Director of the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center. And right now we're based here in Fairbanks we have staff around the state at this point. And we're going to start. This is the second webinar in a 6-part webinar series, and we're really focused on trying to provide an overview of the impacts of domestic violence on abused parents and their children. It's an important topic, but it also is valuable for, I think, all of our work, especially when we're working with families in our communities. So I'm going to turn it over for the other presenters to do their introductions, and then we'll talk with you in a little while. So Paula.
Thank you, Tammy and Becky. Good morning, everyone. My name is Paula Julian. I'm a senior policy specialist with the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. And again, welcome to the Search Staff webinar series, Strengthening Services for Abused Parents and Their Children. I look forward to talking with you this hour. Tien?
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much, Paula and Tammy, for having me here. My name is Tien Ung, as Paula said, and I work for Futures Without Violence in the role of Director of Impact and Learning. And so pleased to be invited. Thank you.
Candy, will you explain use of the GoToMeeting control panel, please, and recording of the webinar?
Sure, of course. So my name is Candy Cowan. I'm the communications coordinator with AK and WRC. And let's look at, if you're not familiar with GoToWebinar, you have the control panel. You should see it on the right-hand side of your screen. Within that control panel, there's a couple of sections that you may want to use throughout this webinar. So the first one is the questions section. That one you're going to use to ask any questions during the webinar that you might have, and we'll try to get to all of those questions throughout the webinar or at the end or follow up. Then there is also, let's see here, the chat section. And in the chat section, you're going to be able to communicate with anybody on the webinar. There are also a number of questions being posted in that section for you guys to take a look at. And then also, if you're having any kind of audio issue, there is the audio section. If you're on the computer and the audio isn't working, click the phone call audio and then go back to the computer audio, and that should reset your connection to make sure that you guys have that. And if it still doesn't work, then go ahead and mute your computer, but call in on the phone so you can see the screen and still get the audio out of your phone. And other than that, today's webinar is being recorded, and we will make those that recording available later on next week. And that's it. Thank you guys for participating.
Thank you, Candy. If you can move the slide forward, please. And again, please, one more slide forward. If there may be a slight delay because of the internet, so please, if the screen looks frozen, just give it a few seconds. So today's webinar goal is to understand the impact of domestic violence on Alaska Native children and their abused parent, and to think about, with that understanding, how are you as a Search behavioral health employee responding and working with and interacting with Alaska Native children and their abused parents. So that's the goal for our webinar today. And that is really at the foundation, at the core of the entire webinar series, is strengthening services for abused parents and their children. Next slide, please. So on the first webinar, just a quick overview, we talked about the trauma of colonization of Alaska Native and American Indian peoples and tribes, and how that impacted abused parents and their children. And so connected to that is the impact itself of domestic violence, which I will now hand over to Tammy. So next slide.
Good morning again. And I'm sure that many of you, because you're working in behavioral health already, have heard about and work around and with various types of trauma that people experience. And I am also positive that you've heard about the adverse childhood experiences, which is in short called ACEs. And I think that it's really important that we talk about the whole issue of trauma, particularly in children, but in parents that are also experiencing trauma when they're trying to raise their children. And so when we talk about an incident, the incident could have many meanings. It could be an intergenerational situation. And we touched on some of that the last time that we were together. That intergenerational being more of, for instance, this is how I was raised, so I'm going to raise, my children this way, or it doesn't impact children because it didn't impact me. Or many times I've heard things like parents say, well, I was spanked and look at, I'm a good person and I turned out fine, or et cetera, et cetera. So it's important that we understand, and that's really minimal when I'm talking about trauma. But it also can be that but trauma can be really complex because there's different layers, and especially when we're talking about children in particular, children will experience that much different than adults. And again, as adults, an adult may not recognize that because in developmental stages, children's brain development, there's just so many things that can impact that. I think that it's very important to understand that sometimes trauma can be just a chronic type of stress or high alert, or especially with domestic violence. It can be something that is happening all the time, and so you think it's almost normal. And so it's a chronic type of experience that there's never like any real time that it feels like a normal level of development and or people being able to act in a relaxed manner. There can be acute trauma, vicarious trauma. Many people, whether they're helpers or community members, can also experience trauma because of situations that have happened. There may be something that's happened in the community that has created a disappearance, or someone has gotten murdered, for instance, in small communities. And what has happened is that whole community has experienced this trauma, but there can be really and what we mean by vicarious is that it may not be experienced by you personally, but there's residual reactions that go along with that. But I really wanted to tie this into the ACEs study because I think that that's a really important scientific study that proves that certain types of traumas experienced by children under the age of 18 really can impact choices, experiences as adults, health, and all kinds of other areas. And I think that it's important that we recognize that. But another piece of that, especially when we're talking about trauma in small tribal communities, or any real small community, but in tribal communities in particular, because that's what we are really focused on, is that sometimes the trauma is exasperated by the services that we do or do not have. For instance, if something happens, particularly with domestic violence, and there's no law enforcement or 911 or any way to respond to that, and it just escalates and you have to run away, or you have to, I have a friend in Amonik, it always describes how they used to have to go hide under the smokehouses with their children in any kind of weather. There was no place to go. And so they were hiding out in the smokehouse until whoever the perpetrator calmed down, quit drinking, whatever the situation was. And so that kind of constant high alert, trying to be safe and no response can add to what we talked about here with that complexity of the trauma. And it starts to be a really chronic, it gets very acute because of the lack of response. And when we talk about that and we talk about disparity, that also ties into all of that. There's another piece that's really, really important that we often don't think about as well, is that especially I am really concerned because especially in tribal communities, Child Protective Services in Alaska, it's called OCS, Office of Children's Services. There's mandatory reporting, and as service providers, we are all mandatory reporters. But there's a great deal of disparity because that response is different for our tribal children than it is for non-tribal children. And what I mean by that is that we have very well-meaning systems, but the fact is that tribal children are more going to be more involved in that system than non-tribal children. The percentages of tribal children that are in that system are at a good deal more. In some cases, 98% of the children in that region or that system are tribal children. And so if there is a response by 911 or the family is intervened in order to try to help keep a parent safe and the child hopefully with that parent, OCS could become involved. And that creates a whole nother level of types of fear and trauma and things that go along with that. So I think it's really important is that we manage our responses to incidences of trauma, and that means that our mindsets, our policies, all of that can be really exasperated by the disparity that's already being experienced in the tribal communities. The other issue that goes along with this is that with the ACEs study, the one thing that it became very clear, because it was a medical doctor that did these studies, is that it was very clearly connected to health as we age. And with the different disparities in health care and health symptoms in the tribal community, diabetes, that's a huge heart disease, suicide and depression. Those are all things that are brought on by a lot of trauma. There's also physiological things, we cannot deny that, but we have such a higher rate in Native communities that these things again can be exasperated by this. So I am going to move on to the next slide, Candy, so that I don't go over my time too much. The one thing I wanted to tie into this is that there's different types. When we talk about the whole idea of an incident, and then we talk about the different various types of things that are happening within that incident and how one person will react or another person will react. You know, I think there was something under this COVID-19, there was a meme on Facebook at some point here, and it talks about we're all on the same ship, right? In this COVID-19 pandemic, we all are experiencing these different losses that of normal life and normal, you know, types of routines and things. But you know what? We're not all on the same boat. Some of us may be on a ship and we're pretty comfortable. We still have our jobs. We're still able to be with our family. We have food on the table. We're not as worried economically. And there's other people that are on small little buoys or little tiny rowboats with holes in it. And oftentimes that's what we mean when we talk about disparity, is we talk about, you know, we aren't all on the same ship. We may be in the same experience, but we're not in the same ship because of responses, because of experiences, because of maybe where we live and who we are. And so community trauma can be a really big piece of the reactions in situations like this and other reactions that we talked about. You know, a good example of that is gang violence, mass violence, disaster. And we're all experiencing some of that now. In every community in this country, we're experiencing this whole stress around the pandemic. And that means a lot of different things. But in people's homes where domestic violence is current and where children are often in those homes, it's extreme for them in many cases. We do talk about historical trauma or intergenerational trauma or multiple traumas. And again, last week when we talked about colonization, slavery, I mean, that's not that many generations removed. The genocidal behavior, and of course, Native American people and Alaska Natives have experienced that in their lifetime. Insidious trauma. And this one is a little bit more, as it's insidious, systematic oppression. And we just talked about that in terms of response, incident responses. When you don't have enough to deal with the issues that you have, whether that's mental health, whether that's law enforcement, whether that's other kinds of safe space for people that are experiencing difficulties or are being beaten or whatever it is, sexual harassment. And sexual harassment isn't just in the workplace, as you know, it's around the country. It's almost like it's an underlying, it's okay to sexually harass other people, and there's nothing that's being done about it. And that can be very traumatic. People will respond in different ways, but it's still extremely traumatic. Religious persecution. We are experiencing not so much religious persecution at this point, but persecution because of who we are as people, whether that's a Native person or if you are right now, there's a lot of persecution of people that are not understood, immigrant population and other things. So I'm going to go ahead and that was really quick, but I want to turn it over to Tian, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Tammy. Next slide, please. I just want to bridge from what Tammy was laying out in terms of incidences to try to focus some of our learnings on, you know, how we want to understand the impacts of trauma and all the traumas that Tammy was talking about and what that means when it comes to service design, program and practice design, as well as policy design. So I want to just underscore all of the things that Tammy was just laying out and plant the seed that, you know, it wasn't so long ago that we used to think that how we think, feel, and act were all sort of differentiated and separate, and even sort of occupied different and separate areas or regions in our brain. But the best of our current knowledge and the best of our current science over the last, you know, 2 decades really tells a different story, and it tells the story that that involves a back and forth, bidirectional process of communication that's happening constantly between our environments and the experiences and the conditions that we have, and how our body processes all of those experiences and conditions, such that all of the experiences and conditions that Tammy was talking about has sort of 3 different types of impacts on us and our well-being. And as Tammy was saying, acute stress and traumatic stress can get under the skin and impact us biologically or physically. And when that happens to us in a chronic way, in a prolonged way, and early in childhood, it can have lifelong negative impacts on our physical health. And that's what the ACEs study was all about, finding that correlation between later preventable disease like cardiovascular disease, even pulmonary disease, and even sort of life course, our life expectancy. All of these things can be impacted by the early experience of adversity without the right supports. We also know that for design purposes, that the experiences and conditions that Tammy was talking about can impact us psychologically, meaning how we think, feel, act, learn, and engage with the world around us. And then lastly, we also know that the experience of trauma and adversity can impact us socially. It can impact us interpersonally, but we also know that the roots of trauma are also present and highly correlated with social conditions that as healthcare providers and as mental health providers, you're working daily to try to address conditions, as Tammy was saying, like mental health, suicide, certainly family violence, addiction. Many of those adversities have roots in traumatic experiences over the life course. So the primary takeaway point here is to think about designing interventions and programs and services in a way that takes into consideration the cultural experiences, the traumas that people have experienced, and thinking succinctly about, you know, where you can have an impact and where you want to make an impact. Are you addressing health issues, psychological issues, or social issues? As I said, we know from the science that intervention in at any of these levels is interconnected and can lead to positive outcomes overall for people. So next slide, please. So just building on that idea and zeroing in a little bit more specifically in terms of what your targets of intervention would be, we know from the science, and as Tammy was saying, that the reason why traumatic experiences can have impacts in those three areas is it elevates our stress response system. And we also know that not all stress is the same, and that our stress response system is incredibly susceptible not only to individual variation, so how we are as individuals, but also how we are as communities, and is very sensitive to environmental intervention. So from a lot of the science, we've come to understand that stress can either be positive, tolerable, or toxic, depending on the experiences and the conditions that we create for people in the lives that they live on a day-to-day basis, such that, you know, the type of stress that Tammy was highlighting, which led to some of those longer term outcomes, is the type of stress that we call toxic, which means it happens in early childhood. It happens in a prolonged, acute, and chronic way without relief or without any type of buffering, meaning in the absence of protective relationships. But we also have a lot of literature and science that tells us that when we can get the right responses in place, the right supports in place, when we can reduce the amount of time that people live under stress and adversity and trauma, when we can buffer their experiences through supportive relationships, we can shift biologically and psychologically the impacts of that stress and improve both mental health and health outcomes in the long run. And then, of course, there's also the types of stress that we experience, which can be positive stress. So not all stress is bad. And in fact, there's some stress experiences that we need to have that actually helps us to sort of build our resilience and builds our adaptivity, and helps us to actually do well in the long run, and adapt in the long run, which is what we talk about when we talk about creating the specific experiences and conditions that promote resilient outcomes. And so with that, I'm going to hand this back over to Paula to begin to sort of highlight why resilience is such an important concept, especially for Native communities, and the ways in which designing to resilience and service delivery is a pathway for positive outcomes in health and mental health for tribal communities. Paula?
Thank you so much, Tian. Next slide, Candy, please. And so as Tian was talking, you know, and she was, the piece that Tian was talking about in terms of the right responses is really as staff at Search, it's thinking about how can you respond to abused parents and their children in ways that promote resilience. And so what is resilience? It's a range of creative responses enabling survival in the face of threat. And I think that is what we have seen with Native people in Alaska, in the lower 48, and in Hawaii, is in the face of the colonization and the domestic violence and other related disparities, Native peoples are not only surviving, but they're thriving. And so if we think about all the ways in which they're doing that, and how as Search, you can help support that resilience and support and help improve health outcomes through the various services that Search provides, I think is really critical. And, you know, being creative about how, as health professionals, you do that. So if you do that through your partnerships with different community organizations, or if you do that, you know, participating in these webinars, having discussions with each other at Search and with your partners around how you can help improve those health outcomes and promote the resilience that we see in, you know, that has helped Native people survive through all of the challenges they've experienced. And one of the best ways that I like to show that resilience is this. If you go to the next slide, please, Candy, is this video that these youth, tribal youth from Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, put together that really says it all. I can't say it any better than I think they've said it. And so if you can play this, Candy, that would be awesome.
One morning I woke up and I heard my brother crying. He was screaming so loud you thought someone was dying. Mom, Dad, he screamed, but there was no use trying. They weren't around. I ran outside and saw he'd had a pretty bad crash. His bike was in the ditch, down his arm a bloody gash. He looked so pitiful, just sitting there in the dirt amongst the trash, crying, I want Mom and Dad. I picked him up and started running toward my uncle's up the way. It started raining and got real dark. You could barely tell it was day. My brother cried and asked, Sister, where's Mom? I didn't know what to say. When the truth is, I don't know. When my uncle saw us coming, he ran into the yard. He took my brother from me and he held him in his arms. When he saw my face, I could tell he was alarmed. He said, "What happened? Did you fall too?" "Uncle, I'm so tired of wondering why. Why do they drink? Why do they do drugs? Why do they leave us? Why?" He said, "Sister, it's hard to explain." And I said, "Uncle, try." And then he told this story.
Once this land was teepees as far as you can see. The water was clean, the land pristine. We were where we were meant to be. Then strangers came across the sea and brought with them their disease. Our people cried and prayed and sang, and brought them to their knees. Imagine that your family, and most of all your tribe, what if most of everyone you love suddenly got sick and died? And before you even had a chance to bury them and mourn, the strangers came and took away the land where you were born. And you wondered if your parents even cared as they stole you and your brother away, or if they'd been so beaten down they had nothing left to say. And then at school, they cut your hair and beat you if you spoke. The language that Creator gave our people on earth alone. We rise from the darkness. We will overcome it. For your spirit lives within us. We shall remain. Sister, I'm not trying to tell you that your mom and dad are okay, or that they're not responsible for the choices that they've made. But you see this bloody wound on your little brother's arm. If we don't clean it, it won't heal, and it'll do all kinds of harm. Those deep wounds of our ancestors still bleed within our hearts. When we remember all they've done, that's where the healing starts. So every morning when you wake, you pray this prayer out loud. Creator, help me live in a way that would make my ancestors proud. We rise from the darkness. Don't you forget this. You can be anything you want to be. We will overcome. Just work hard, never give up. Perseverance is the key. Strength, dignity, honor, that's all in your family tree. So hold your head up high and know that. We rise from the darkness.
Creator, help me live in a way that will make my ancestors proud. Creator, help me live in a way that will make my ancestors proud. Creator, help me live in a way that will make my ancestors proud. Little brother, we will rise up from this darkness. Little brother, we will overcome the pain. Remember, warrior spirits live within us. We shall remain.
So I thank you very much for indulging us. And I realize the audio may not have been the best, but I did post in the chat section the web link to the video if you would like to listen to it after the webinar. And I even encourage you to share it with abused parents and children that come into your clinic, because the message that these young children shared with anyone who watches the video is one of resilience and one of strength. And the question for all of us is, how can we support their capacity to not only survive but to thrive, and to be the best that they can be. And I think that there's nothing that is, as one tribal elder in the village of Amonik said, nothing is impossible. Everything is possible. And I think that, everything that you all are doing there at Search, I just ask that you all think about all the possibilities that you have available to you to support that resilience. And so I will turn it over back to Tammy for the next slide.
Thank you. And that video always, these young people actually wrote the script and directed it with the help of some filmmakers in a project that they were working on. And it just is amazing, just the degree of the message that they've sent with that video. And I think that that goes right back into the talk about resilience and the fact that tribal sovereignty, for so many years, tribes had to hide their pride. In many ways, people had to not be proud of the fact that they have survived their indigenous, and there are, even if their culture isn't necessarily what it was, 100 years ago, there's still a sense of identity. So, and tribal sovereignty has its own sense of identity and strength, and that is a sense of resilience, relearning your language or continuing to talk your language, relearning and or continuing your dance ceremonies or your other types of cultural, ceremonial type of practices, relearning or continuing to make the foods that have always been a comfort but that have more of a cultural relevancy. Those are the kinds of, but tribal sovereignty is bigger than that. Each one of us is sovereign in our own rights, our own bodies, but tribal sovereignty is bigger because we are a government aside from just identity of a cultural identity. So it's a big topic, and we don't have a whole lot of time at all today to kind of go there, but there's a sense of identity that goes with that. I think that one of the things that the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center, one of our whole premises of how we do our work is about the voices and the languages and the teachings of the people that we work with. For instance, working with any tribe, there's 229 very distinct tribes in Alaska. In Southeast, there's similarities, of course, between families, clans, languages. There's a lot of similarity, but each one of those tribal communities and or tribes have differences in how they are, how their citizens identify and the work that they or accomplish or their villages run. There's differences. So it's really being attuned to the fact that those differences and those strengths and listening to what the tribe itself is saying is really, really valuable and important. When we talk about our elders, when we talk about, the fact that their stories and their guidance keeps us strong in many ways, it's an important concept. And I think that for all of our TA and work, we really that is our main focus. We need to listen to the voices of the community or the tribe that we're listening to and the people that we're listening to. The language is not necessarily the native language, but the underlying meanings of language, because there's a lot more being said with that. And there's a lot more people identifying than rather, just language per se. And the teachings, just like these young people are talking about in this film, the teachings have strength in order for people to try to do something different. The teachings also have the ability to understand why someone may be behaving the way they are, not that it excuses it and not that it makes it better, but it has a strength of resiliency. The other pieces, of course, are always our intelligence, our relationships. Relationships are key to resilience. It's when they talk about protective factors and they talk about how to build resilience, protective factors that are, and one of the biggest pieces about that are relationships, the relationships that we have, the relationships that support us in whatever way that looks like. Priorities, you know, oftentimes we can make different choices. It's not always easy, but if we have the supports around us to do that, we can make the priorities look differently that help in our resilience as we go forward in life. Emotional intelligence. I mean, obviously it takes some intelligence to be able to kind of get through all of that to survive. And I think that oftentimes, especially for children who are raised in constant trauma or in survival mode, they're extremely bright. No matter if it's book learning or not, they've had to learn to survive in so many different ways, and they've become really, really good at the things that maybe they should be, but they're really good at it. And so they're able to, they have a lot of intelligence and had to think things through. I don't want to spend a lot of time, although resilience is the hugest and I think the biggest, most important piece that we need to remember. And I would ask you all to possibly do some self-assessment. And we're going to type into the box. I can't type and talk at the same time. But a couple of questions I would, really consider is that what shows up most frequently and how. When we talk about resilience and we talk about even strength-based kind of work when we're working with families or children or individuals, is what shows up the most frequently in those relationships or conversations that kind of show that there is resilience? Is it support from other people? Is it the fact that they have something in their lives that they feel they're doing well? But I would actually self-assess ourselves in how that impacts us personally as well. And then what's showing up the least? For instance, in this whole wheel of resilience, maybe identity isn't the strength here. Maybe what it is that whole emotional intelligence, maybe that is what is really keeping somebody going. They want to finish school, they want to get through that, and emotions aren't the biggest part of that. But that's the resilience. That's what keeps that person going. What opportunities do you see to innovate and become more culturally responsive in your work, to deepen your work? And I think that these are questions that we can all ask ourselves. I have to ask myself these types of questions pretty regularly because I can't assume that I know what I know or I don't. And I know that's kind of a, dancing around a little bit. But the fact is that if we don't question ourselves when we're working with people, then we're not going to be able to really connect, are we? And so it's really important that that connection understands what the other person may not necessarily being experiencing, but then also trying to see some of the good and the bad and the indifferent, so to speak. And so I think it's an important assessment tool for ourselves in terms of resilience. So I'm going to go ahead and turn
Tammy?
it back. Yes?
We actually did type, thanks Etienne, we typed the questions into the chat box for everyone. So if you
Okay.
look in your chat box, you can look at the questions there. And again, we encourage you as some additional work, we might even include it on a webinar survey. We ask that you consider answering these questions. So they're there.
Thank you, Paula. And so now I'm going to turn it back over to Paula and Tien to kind of help us start wrapping things up.
Next slide, Candy. I think, what's the next? I think you have the next slide, Tam. Let me see.
Yes, it's the domestic violence. Yeah, there we go. Oops. Oh, there it is. Okay. Yeah, there you go.
Okay, great. Tien?
Sure. I'm happy to jump in. Thank you so much. So just to pile on to what Tammy was just laying out, we wanted to wrap up by highlighting sort of domains or strategies of service innovation or practice or program innovation that you might begin to look at as you think about the self-assessment in terms of the ways in which your programs and your practices and your policies are enabling resilience or working against resilience. And so I think an important takeaway from the science of resilience that we've learned over the last, couple of decades is that, resilience is something that's it's different from sort of traits or character states. And it's not the same thing, for example, as having grit or perseverance or determination. And it's really something that can and should be built and nurtured and cultivated and sustained. And as Tammy was highlighting some of the dimensions of resilience that you might think about in your work with individuals and families, we wanted to end this conversation by highlighting some of the things that you might take on as systems or institutions or as service delivery systems with direct implications for children and families burdened by domestic violence. So following a deep dive and review of the science and the literature relative to domestic violence, Futures, the organization that I work for, cultivated sort of these 5 protective factors that lend themselves and promote healing and recovery and well-being for both children and adult survivors of domestic violence. And so as you take up the charge that Tammy and Paula are inviting you to do, we would ask you to sort of think about the ways in which your practices, your systems, and your policies cultivate any of these 5 protective factors, which are less about the individual and more about what systems and programs and practitioners can do in the collective. So to what degree are you and do your practices promote safer and more stable conditions for the children and families that you serve? In what ways and how might your programs foster spiritual, cultural, and social connections as part of your programming for children and families, since we know, especially for children and families impacted by domestic violence, that those social supports can serve as really important protective factors to their not only their safety, but their enduring well-being and their recovery and their resilience. Certainly, how does your program cultivate resilience and growth mindset? And when you think about that, really try to dig into those dimensions of resilience and the components of resilience that Tammy was just going over. And then finally, how do your programs and practices and policies support and nurture parent-child interactions? Or what ways might your program or expectations or policies or practice work against parent-child interactions? Some of the things that Tammy was highlighting earlier at the beginning of this talk in terms of even looking at your mandated reporting policy, right? What are the practices and policies that you have in place around mandated reporting, and in what ways do they take into account sort of cultural perspectives and parent-child interactions and relationships? And then finally, we like to really remind people that social and emotional abilities are skills to be sort of taught, to be nurtured, and to be practiced. And while psychoeducational efforts are certainly important in teaching children and families about sort of their emotions and their emotional intelligence and their sort of social skills, it's really, really critical. We know from the science that skill begets skill. So the more that you can take a look at your programs and kind of audit to what degree do we engage in coaching, direct skill building around social and emotional abilities versus sort of awareness generation. What opportunities do we give our children and families? What opportunities do we create for them to practice, right, social and emotional skills versus learning about social and emotional skills? So I don't know if there's anything else you want to highlight here, Paula, just to sort of ensure that we're thinking about these factors through the lens of tribal sovereignty. But let me step aside so that you can get in there.
Yes, thank you, Tian. And when Tian and I were talking yesterday about DV protective factors, I think I had pointed out that looking at these 5 protective factors, working with Indian tribes and Native Hawaiians now for more than half my life. As a Filipina, I had to point out that when I see these protective factors and think about them, I see them from 2 different lenses, from 2 different perspectives. One is the Native perspective, and one is as a Filipina and non-Native. And so I was talking to Tian about how for Native peoples and all that I have learned, understanding that lens and that sovereignty, as Tammy mentioned in the previous slide, is something that we can't take out of the picture and we can't discount as not important or relevant to this work, and particularly in the health arena, understanding that, and it's true in any arena, but thinking in the health arena as an example, that the way in which health services, healthcare supports the ability for Native people and Indian tribes to take care of their own and support them in taking care of their own. And SEARCH is a tribal facility that serves both Native and non-Native, but the history behind SEARCH was that it was founded to address the needs of health needs of Native people that were not being addressed. And so I think just keeping that in mind, that if you're Native or non-Native, that the way in which you respond and support these protective factors for Native peoples has to just keep that in mind, that the way in which you see and define these protective factors, are you defining it from the voices, languages, and teachings of Native sovereign tribes and peoples, or are you defining it from a non-Native perspective? So I just wanted to add that in here at this slide. And I don't know if Tammy had anything more to add before we close out today's webinar on this piece, at least.
The only thing that I would add, because I really appreciate the expertise, is that of both you and Tian, but I think the only thing that I would add is that, it is a fact that oftentimes healing comes with identity, and tribal sovereignty and the voices and languages and teachings of who you are as an identity is a really powerful way to help children, but also adults connect. And that means connect within themselves. And that is a huge piece of, as we all know, mental health. It's also a huge piece of strength in terms of moving forward sometimes, and getting past things that may have harmed us and harmed who we think we are. So I think that it's really valuable, and it does have some real value for that person. And one other thing really briefly is that we may not be able to do the things culturally that we did. Again, I always emphasize this 100 years ago, because we may not remember, we may not know. And so we start from what we've got and we learn what we have now, and that's what we build on, and that's part of the strength of that. So again, I appreciate your allowing us to speak with you about this. So I'm going to turn it back over to Paula.
Thank you, Tammy, and thank you, Tian. Candy, next slide, please. So on this next slide is just two resources that we have. And as I was sitting here listening to the webinar, we already knew that there are going to be more resources. And again, by the end of this 6-part webinar series, we will compile for Becky to share with you all of those resources. But hopefully each month you all are looking into the resources that we do share with you. And if it's generating questions, I think that, you know, we have our contact information on the next slide, Candy. So please feel free to reach out to any of us at any time for any questions. But again, thank you for joining us for today's webinar. It looks like for this one, we are just about wrapping up on time. If you haven't registered for the remaining webinars between now and September, there's the link at the top of the screen. And again, our contact information. We thank Becky and Serge for organizing these. Hopefully they are helpful. You'll be receiving a survey from Strategic Prevention Solutions for this webinar. So thank you again for completing that. And I don't know if Becky, Tammy, or Tian had any closing comments.
I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for participating in this webinar. If you have any questions for Paula, Tammy, or Tian, feel free to email them to me and I can email it to them, or Paula has sent out a couple emails to the staff, so you can feel free to email her directly as well, and she can send it to Tammy and Tian, so either way is fine. And I really appreciate everyone being here today, and I will see all of you one way or the other later.
Thank you
Tammy,
for having me, everyone. Sorry,
Alrighty.
Paula. I was just thanking you and Tammy and Becky for having me. I really appreciated being here.
And this is Tammy again. Thank you, everyone. We really do appreciate your attention, and also thank you, Tian and Paula and Rebecca, for the hard work, and Candy. Thank you for helping to keep us running on this webinar. So we'll hopefully we'll talk with you all on June 18th, and look forward to that. Have a
Thank
bye-bye.
you, everybody. Have a beautiful day.
Thanks, you too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Oh, I should probably.
Okay, are you all there?
Yes.
Okay. Tammy, are you still there? She might have signed off. Candy, are you still there? Okay. Maybe we'll, Tian, do you want to debrief?
Sure. Would that be helpful to you?
Yeah, I would. Let me send you, I think the same line that we might have used yesterday, we could still use.
Okay.
Hi,
So-
I'm back on. Sorry, I hit the wrong button.
Oh, it's okay. I was just telling Tian we can debrief on the Uber line, the one that we used yesterday, if that's okay.
Yeah, let me just make sure nobody's on it. I'll just double check that very, very quickly. I don't think so this morning, but I have learned my lesson about checking that. Let's see, today it looks like we are okay. So 855-524-0131.
Oh.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Paul and Tammy. I'm just getting this big text in. I only have a half an hour in my schedule today, which is now between 1 and 1:30, and it looks like my team has some questions for me.
Okay, no worries.
I'm so sorry. Can I catch back up with you another time? I mean, I really want to participate in your debrief. Okay. Maybe we can find
We'll schedule it another time.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Bye.
Okay. Thank you.
No worries. Uh-huh.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Okay, Tam, we'll call on the other line.